Fredrik Erixon. Thanks very much for joining me today. How are you?
Oh, fine. And you?
Good, good. I'm very excited to have people from the EU joining a US centric podcast. I think we need more collaboration. The world is getting smaller and smaller uh, from all perspectives, from policy, from technology, from people, and so on and so on. So I'm very excited to have you. And before we jump into our topic today, which is the recent publication by your organization, why don't we walk me through memory lane? Just
Sure.
how you become to be influencer in the policy and AI and cloud computing.
So you mean my own background going into it, or what
Yes.
I've been doing? Yeah. I mean, the way I'm looking at it is that, regardless what point in history that you're going to dip your toe into, if you really want to understand the broad factors of change, especially in the economy, you have to step into technology, and you have to look at, in that particular historical period of time, what did technology do in order to reshape the way you produce, the way you consume, the way you interact with other people. And for me, coming from more sort of an international economic background, that was my academic background. That's what I've been working on in the past. Even if we didn't start off by talking technology, technology is what it's all about. If you want to understand changes that happen over the long term that generate prosperity, you have to understand technology. And now we're lucky because we live in a period where at least there is a promise of pretty fast technological change that can emerge, especially on the back of sort of the broad change in computer technology and data that started a few decades ago. And I find that just to be exciting to see how it reshapes the way we work, the way we collaborate with each other, the way companies are structured, the way profits and value is generated in the economy. And stepping into cloud or AI or quantum or, all these different aspects that you can take sort of a look into this particular world, it's just very, very exciting. And that's what I love about this field.
Yeah, it's never a dull moment. So were you always interested in technology growing up?
I mean, in one way or the other. I mean, not interested in the sense that I was the number one computer geek in my village where I grew up, for that you went to in order to sort of play the versions of computer games that existed when I was young. But I've always been fascinated more by what technology does to society than technology itself. If you want someone to sort of open up the hood of a computer and explain how these things operate, I'm not the right person to go and ask. But I'm more curious about what happens to people and what happens to organization on the back of technology. And the broader question behind that, of course, is what happens with people when they acquire more knowledge, when you begin to structure science and have a structured pursuit of knowledge, which is it's an old phenomenon in itself. But if you think about the rise of academia and the rise of science, it's basically the late 19th century where we start to do it for real. And my God, how that's been reshaping society. So that's what I'm fascinated about.
And if we look back, it's funny because sometimes you can only tell you're in the midst of unbelievable change post the change. Like, if you look in hindsight to what happened, we talked about industrial revolution, right? When people were in the midst of it, I don't think that they saw it as an industrial revolution. They just saw things coming, changing, and so on. Can you point a finger and we are arguably in one right now with the introduction of AI and technological changes. Can you point a finger in terms of when did it start and why? And again, we can discuss this. Why things seems to be accelerating from all fronts in adoption, in deployments, and in the effect it has on society.
Mm. Well, I think sort of one way to approach that is to ask sort of what is a good indicator of how technology is impacting on your own life. And my my best, I mean, the one thing that I ask myself, and the one thing that I ask to a lot of organizations and companies that I from time to time work with is, so can you tell me, what have you stopped doing over the last, say, week, month, year, in order to start doing something else, something where you can allocate resources in a better way, where you can economize the resources in a better way. And I still think this is probably the biggest question to ask, because innovation in its essence is basically about stop doing things and start doing new things. And when you pose the question like that, that's also when you're going to figure out that many individuals and many organizations are very, very conservative, that it takes a long time to change things, and individuals and organizations may not be very good at it, which is why if we look at the sort of the broad changes that technology has brought to the economy, it usually comes from new players, from new companies, new entrepreneurs who come up with doing a thing which we didn't do in the past and that all organizations weren't prepared to do. So I sometimes use the example. I mean, I'm a Swede by birth, so I've sort of been close to the big telecom development that emerged in the 1990s on the back of companies like Ericsson and, of course, Finnish Nokia. And what is amazing about that development and these companies is that by the late 1990s, early 2000s, they basically had all the products that Apple later came to pioneer. Nokia tried with a touchscreen mobile phone. They started to develop an app store. Ericsson launched a product that they called it a cordless web screen, and today we know it as an iPad. They developed these products, but then they decided not to go ahead and market them in any broader way. And they can come up with sort of all goods of explanations to why are not marketing new technologies that you are pioneering yourself. But at the heart of it was that they weren't willing to start to compete with themselves, because they already had other ranges of products that were extremely profitable, and these new technologies was basically going to start to compete with themselves. So that's why they didn't put sort of a lot of money into trying to create these markets that Apple later came to create. And I find that very fascinating, that back then, of course, if you were thinking, which are the companies in the world who are going to lead a broad development where individuals are going to work with screens and with different type of devices that structure their working life, their professional life, you would point to companies like Ericsson, Nokia, and say, these are probably the two companies that are going to lead that revolution. Both companies they are still around, but they are sort of just a shred of what they were back in the 1990s, and they weren't prepared to do the change. Same thing with individuals themselves. I mean, if you really want to figure out what the trends are going to be 10 years from now, don't look at people like myself. Rather look at the 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds and see their way of interaction with technology. That's what it's going to look like 10 years from now.
And we're a creature of habit. We are resistant to change, and individually as well as collectively for organizations. And I think that's what's happening at the leadership level. People that are, if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. Let's continue with the status quo. The issue is, as you described with the Ericsson example, and is that things are not, we don't live in a bubble, meaning whether you want it or not, you're going to be affected by change, regardless of what you think you can affect or not do. And so that's a great segue to what we're going to be talking about. So first, let's talk a bit about the organization. You're part of the European Center for International Political Economy. Talk to me about the mandate for the organization and the requirements. What's its goals to achieve in the European Union?
So I'm in the fortunate position because I was the one who actually created this organization, and I did it very much on on the basis of my own work experience. I had been having a career where I had one foot in academia, another foot in policy, and I've been working for governments and for international organizations. I had one foot in journalism, and I had one foot in business, and especially investment banking that I've been working in. So,
and Fredrik, it sounds like the absolute perfect mix. It's very tough to find somebody with all those different domains, expertise.
Yes, but here's the thing. I love doing all these things. My only problem was that I didn't just want to do one of them. So I was trying to figure out for myself, so what can I do where I can combine all these different things in order to have a working life of the kind that I want to have? And I think creating a think tank became the answer. Now, I was fortunate to have other people around me who were also interested in doing that type of project, which was, trying to figure out how the international economy is going to be reshaped on the back of technology and other forces that are changing our society. Basic stuff like demography and the demographic development, for instance. Trying to find a way to engage with some of these fundamental long-term developments that policymakers rarely have the time or perhaps even the willingness in order to engage with them. But our basic purpose was basically, let's try to force these issues onto the agenda, and let's try to engage with policymakers and see the extent to which at least we can bring analysis to them, which help them to figure out what type of policies that are going to they're going to use in order to be more capable of adopting to these changes, work with them in order to create more benefits, more prosperity.
And the policymakers themselves, I think that one of the issues, or I guess the attributes for a policymaker, they may be a little older, from talking about demographics. They're not necessarily at the forefront of technology. You can see it here in the U.S., members of Congress. Sometimes you can see like they're not tech savvy at all, to say the least. Yet, they're sitting in the kind of the inner round rooms and decision making process for some major technological decisions and policy that are affecting these decisions. So it's a bit of an oxymoron there. So talk to me about the day to day. It's a big task, right? So influencing, it's almost like you're a small tugboat trying to move this giant cruise ship. That's basically how I see it, because it's the cruise ship is moving regardless of where you if you're going to be there or not, to try to divert it. How does that happen on a day-to-day basis in actuality? And it's, if you don't mind, open up the kimono to some of those processes.
I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that, the ship of state is a big tanker that it's moving slowly. And
I was being kind. I said it was cruise ship, but I think
yes,
a tanker
indeed.
is a little bit better.
Yes. And if you want to change it, you're going to change it sort of by 1 degree at a time. That's, making a 180-degree U-turn is going to take a very, very long. And especially going to take a long time if you look at sort of mature, almost saturated type of political systems where, there is a lot of capital which has been invested in the current structure of industry. There's a lot of prestige and other emotions invested in policies and what type of policy structures we have. Other countries can move faster. One of the countries, I just came back from the country, one of my country that I follow very, very closely is South Korea, which is a country which has changed profoundly over a short period of time. And not just change in the way that they have caught up on the frontier economies in terms of GDP per capita, but in terms of actually moving to the frontier, leading the technological development in many ways.
I believe Fredrik, I believe they're in the 2050s already, compared to what we are.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and it's the same thing. I mean, if you are in countries like, smaller states like Singapore, that you will find that the way your life is going to be organized is much more technology intensive than it is in New York, in Miami, or any other metropolis in America, where you would at least superficially think that these are really sort of cool places in terms of what they do with new technologies, but it's nothing compared to these countries. And some of that is a benefit because they don't have a lot of sunk costs, so they can start and move a bit faster than more mature and saturated economies can do. But there are also examples of that kind of economies that you can actually get change. And how does change happen? Well, part of it is information. Part of it is new knowledge, and that's where we come in terms of trying to be helpful in bringing out the data, trying to look at the broad patterns, trying to identify the issues that are important and see how existing policies actually relate with these important things. But the other thing is motivation. And motivation is a much, much bigger problem. I think we underestimate how important it is. The information problem, if we can take it like that, is actually pretty small in relation to the motivation problem that many policymakers have. So, I mean, if you talk about creating more opportunities for AI, or how can we change education systems in order to actually use technology in a constructive way, which they offer to do. The problem there is not information. You're not going to convince more teachers, more school administrators by more information. It's a motivational issue. And that's much more difficult. And I think that's where having constructive political leadership, having leaders within organizations that are, open and willing to test, explore new things, and just be open-minded about it, and be transparent in the way they talk about what we're doing right now, estimating risk, estimating benefits in ways that are more honest than we're doing right now. I mean, when we start with many of these technology decisions right now, I give you an example. So we've been looking quite a lot into how public administrations use cloud. And when you step into that area, you will, of course, immediately see that many public administrations work with data which is very sensitive. It's personal data. It can be everything from your health records to if there is a sort of a council which has forced a parent to move the children to a different home, for instance. I mean, these are extraordinarily important and sensitive issues. So when you start to think about, can we find a cloud solution to these information systems that we're creating about it, you have to understand the risk. You will have to work in a way to ensure that you're capable of having a secure system. But you have to put that in relation to the security of what you're doing right now. Because what you're doing right now is not a secure system either. And we were working with a public administration in one country where it turned out that when they were going to send information about council having to go and basically take children out of their homes in order to place them in a different environment where they're safer, that decision was sent by fax. And they had pre-programmed the fax, so it actually went to the wrong recipient. Now, fortunately, that recipient understood quite immediately that this is very sensitive information. I need to contact them in order to avoid them sending me fax about individuals that have been deemed not capable of taking care of their own children. But they didn't change the pre-programmed fax number, so it continues to be telefaxes sent to the same other private organization, which was a building company. So having not just honesty and transparency about the risks with new technologies, but also with what you're doing right now, because we have, of course, sort of status quo bias, and we think that what we're doing right now, that's the most safe and secure way we're doing, but it isn't. And quite often, that's where the failures happens, when we're not prepared to have that openness and transparency of the problems with our current ways of doing things.
And I would say that some of these are e-fax. I mean, just the fax, but it's an sort of old school fax machine. It's an e-fax service that may or may not be secure either. And I'm sure that the we can probably spend the next few hours just talking about these type of examples. You know, that it's littered with examples that
Yes.
some of them are just seems almost like trivial. Why would they not? You know, it's such a sensitive information. Why wouldn't it just reconfirm the fax number? And we communicate by email, which is kind of the main source of communication. And emails can be, just by the nature of email protocols, is pretty open. There's man in the middle. There's business email compromise. If somebody really wants to get into the system, they can lurk into the email system and be waiting for a transaction. We've seen that a lot with some transfer funds and so on. And talk to me about, we talked about the kind of the process. So the issue is in democracies, you have the politicians that they want to get elected and want to get voted. So they have to, a lot of times, look at the popular decision. So, someone would say, okay, we can leverage AI to create an unbelievable type of individual instructions for kids, for children, for, completely unbelievable, tailored, and do it in such a, but are you going to be popular with the teachers union, the millions of people that are working in these jobs and are at the voting age? So, where I'm going with this. Sometimes it seems like you're better off with somebody who can make the decisions that's not based on the popular vote. Am I going to get elected? Because we see that all the time. We also see some of the economic policies, right, where everybody wants to have a $50 minimum wage, and it sounds great. It sounds phenomenal. I want to, and I think let's give everybody. The only problem is then a burger costs $50 because the cost of manufacturing, running the business is sky high. But it's on the surface, it's a great it's a great offering. So how do we solve that and I'm not saying it's all bad. Democracies have its own merit. Obviously, I'm a great proponent of that type of regime, but is there anything we can do? And then on top of that, there's all these lobbyists, right, in Washington and in the EU, where they affect policymakers a certain way. Enterprise also does it, right? They spend millions, not billions, into affecting the policymakers by contributing to the campaigns. So it's a long preempt to declare we have a problem, but sky's not falling. And I would love for you to kind of brainstorm, because again, you're looking to affect and make the change. How can we resolve this type of issue where it's fundamental how our economies and how our political system is run?
Well, I think that goes to the heart of that motivational problem that I was trying to talk about, which is, there is one element to it which is about information, but as I said, the informationist problem is pretty
Secondary.
small in comparison.
Yeah.
Pretty small in comparison to the motivational problem. And I don't really have any major wisdom or theory to offer there. My only experience is that most changes that happen to different systems, whether they are in politics, public policy, or if they are in private organization, they tend to be the results of others having moved forward and established a precedent for what you can do, how you can learn from those who actually went faster than you or went before you in terms of trying to do something else. You have pioneers, entrepreneurs, or others that do the trial and error process and trying to learn from changes, learn from how, for instance, you can work with technology within, say, school system or any other system in order to bring about improvements. And that means you should probably invest more in different mechanisms for transferring learnings from one organization from another, from one system to the other, from one country to the other. And I think this is something which we are heavily underinvested in, just trying to understand what others are doing and learn from what others are doing. If you look at, to go back to the example I used with cloud in public administration, for instance, it's not going to happen by decree, there is going to be a world government or a federal government in DC saying, now every organization is going to do this. I don't think that's going to be the way you can address it, because you're probably never going to get to the point where they can actually make that decision, because resistance is going to be too strong. But you can certainly allow for different experiments to move ahead, and for supporting regulatory, perhaps financially or fiscally if that's needed, with different attempts in order to explore these new things. And once they've done, and if they can demonstrate that they have improved on what they were doing previously, that's an extraordinarily good example to have in order to transfer to other organizations. And even if human nature tend to be conservative, human nature is also pretty clear, pretty sticky when it comes to not wanting to be worse than my peers. And sometimes it's going to be more of a competitive spirit. Sometimes it's a cooperative spirit. Sometimes it's a spirit of sharing knowledge, but working with these dynamics in order to foster change. That's been my experience from processes of change in sort of mature democracies of the type that we're talking about.
And sometimes events, like large-scale events, are also causing change. I'll give you an example. I just heard the other day that the Second World War is what created the canned food. The forces were looking at so they created something to solve an issue during that time. And then now I don't say that canned food is definitely like necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying that it caused some change. And then we've seen just recently the adoption of technology, and then with, for example, the CrowdStrike outage that affected a tremendous amount of systems worldwide. And now Microsoft is coming back and say, well, we're not going to allow some kernel access. But there's some, large scale changes as well, like in terms of how we adopt technologies. And maybe we shouldn't have all Microsoft systems. I know the EU is big on diversity there as well. So let's move to the kind of the paper itself. The EU's $1 trillion gap in ICT and cloud computing capacities, the case for a new approach in cloud policy. So that was a groundbreaking, I would say, paper that really analyzed the case for moving into different way of doing cloud infrastructure. So talk to me about the inception of that paper, what caused it, and then maybe like some of the for people that don't have access to it, maybe just the top three elements in the paper.
Sure. So, one of the major conclusions of the paper, and it's much more geared towards European policymakers, sort of the market for papers for that crowd than it is for international policymakers. But what we're trying to show is that not just years, but even decades of underperformance in Europe when it comes to, on the corporate side, of investing in cloud solutions, investing in data management, structured data management, and when it comes to the regulatory development that has been happening, sometimes on a national level in different European countries and sometimes at the EU level. The result of that underperformance, it builds up over time. And even if the change from one year to another may not be very, very substantial in itself, when you start to aggregate things up over a longer period of time, that's when
we talked about the tanker.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's when the big gaps are going to be seen. And this is what we've seen now with cloud, that European companies, European public administrations, Europe at large is very much behind frontier economies in the world when it comes to investment in cloud solutions and adoption of cloud solutions. Now you can say, well, that may not be a big thing. Well, it is a big thing. It's a big thing for the productivity generations that you can have through cloud, but it's also important for understanding the other forms of technological developments that happens when you have access to structured management of your data. AI, for instance. I mean, there's not going to be any magnificent productivity enhancement with AI unless you have an extraordinarily professional data management in your own organization. And what we've seen, and this is the other thing we were trying to sort of point to in the paper, that underinvestment in cloud also leads to deficiencies in AI and a gap between Europe and frontier economies in the world when it comes to the development of AI and the adoption of AI. It's the same thing if we should start to explore, for instance, quantum technology and what we can do with quantum technology, say 10, 12, 15 years from now. It requires a type of data operations of a kind which forces Europe to invest a lot more into it. We were trying to calculate what these differences were, and we are pointing to basically $1 trillion gap in terms of investments in cloud between Europe and America. I think if we would start to go deeper into some of these figures, for instance, looking at the gap between the EU and the United States when it comes to AI investments, we would definitely see a much greater gap than the one we identified. But the point here is basically to try to force greater economic realism in Europe, and that we need to find ways to invest more in new technology.
And what you mentioned, the AI drivers are huge. I know that here in the States, they're making tremendous investment into AI first data centers, meaning AI has very specific requirements in terms of the power consumption, the deployments of these data centers, and it requires a heavy lifting from a capital expenditure perspective. And you're right, you're not going to see, it's just AI is just a tool, you need to have it deployed somewhere. So why do you think, and everybody wants, I mean, the AI, AI promise is, I'm sure the policymakers are excited to see some of the efficiencies or promises efficiencies at all levels in the private sector as well as the public sector. So why don't they realize that, okay, in order to see the gains and potentially deploy these, you have to invest in infrastructure now. Again, it's nothing that's happening overnight, and not just the infrastructure, but potentially the power sources required. And we're talking about ESG, environmental social governance. So the EU is big on controlling that. So there's a lot going into this. And it's what you describe. It's, if you have to do something now, it will only affect, we're looking at the 2030s by the time things are really ready to be deployed. So why not, why is the gap? Why is such a major gap? And I'm assuming it's a really great that you came out with a paper now and not 2 years from now. I mean, the gap, if you look at the exponential growth of that gap, I'm sure like if you 2 years from now, it would have been like 2.1 trillion. I don't know what the slope of that graph will look like.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's exactly the thing, which is you need to jump on the train. I mean, there is no viable economic strategy here which says, well, let's wait 10 years and let's a few others go ahead and see what can happen with this one, and then we can start to, over that period of time, the amount of capital, of knowledge, of experience that would have gone into it would be so magnificent that it's just extraordinarily difficult to catch up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and the other thing related to what you were saying is that with many of the technologies, you take, for instance, AI, it's not as if AI is a ready-made product which is there on the shelves, and you have a defined desire, like, I want to eat tacos for dinner tonight, and you say, well, I want to have an AI solution for this, and then I just go into the store and buy it. That's not what it is. I mean, AI is more than anything else. It's an evolutionary process within most organizations where you deploy capital, you deploy human capital, and then you start to experiment with your products, your services, your organization in order to try to figure out how this is going to develop over time. And you're going to get gradually better for every day you make these investments, you're going to get better at it. Now, what I see quite often in Europe is sort of more of a conservative attitude to these things, where they are hesitant about, well, we don't know exactly if AI is going to be that beneficial as many people are saying. We can't really see any change would have happened over the past 2 years, so it may not lead to anything grander in the future. All these AI evangelists that are out there preaching how organizations and governments are going to change, we haven't really seen anything of that coming true yet. So why don't we have a more of a wait and see attitude, or perhaps even talk it down? In Europe, there has been attempt to try to draw attention to the fact that, for instance, Facebook haven't been offering some of its AI solutions to European users of Facebook. When Apple released its new iPhone now, iPhone 16, the AI functionality that you can use in America, it's not available in the European market. And the European Commissioner for Competition was basically saying she was relieved that she wouldn't have to have an AI functionality in her iPhone. And I think that it's a telling attitude to these things. And it may be that the AI functionality that comes in Apple 16 is not going to be that magnificent, but it's an evolutionary process where I train as a user, where Apple train as a company, and we try to figure out how these things are going to evolve in the future. But in order to be part of that process, you need to be on it. You need to jump on that train and be on it. And if you say, well, I'm actually relieved that I can protect myself from the invasion of AI in my mobile phone, well, then you're probably never going to be in that point where actually participating in that evolutionary process to the degree necessary in order to see the long-term compound benefits that are going to emerge.
And as we discussed, we don't live in a bubble, meaning that in order for the EU to stay competitive, you have to leverage some of those processes, and maybe there's no immediate impact, and I would beg to differ. I would say that if you look at the adoption of AI in, for example, financials, it's staggering. It's really staggering. It's and of course they're early adopters, but they're looking at ways to save money and make more money with AI. Basically, that's the driver. And there are also potential drivers looking at technological innovation, right? So if you can allow the adoption of a faster iteration, for example, in biotech, using the AI models and so on. There's so many applications, and you're right. It's you cannot put your head in the sand and pretend like it's not going to happen. It's going to happen regardless. If the EU is, and I think also people would demand for it. I mean, I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of people that are going to try to enable it, regardless of the trying to jailbreak or trying to apply something else on top of it. Recently, and this is very timely, the French member of European Commission resigns, he was criticizing the executive branch. I believe there's just talk about specifically around the EU digital policy. I believe it was Bretton's. And this has just happened just the other day. Do you have the backdrop of that, and is that related to some of the things that you're trying to do in terms of moving innovation quicker? Because I know that they were against, like just at a very high level, they were against some of the innovation that was being pushed from the US.
So I mean, there are probably many reasons for why, not just why I decided to resign. I think that was just a an acknowledgement of the fact that many of the member states in the EU, so national governments in Germany or Netherlands, Ireland, etc., they weren't happy with him. They think that he has chosen an approach to how we can generate faster technological-driven economic growth in Europe, where it just hasn't happened, and where he'd become more of a roadblock to the type of changes that needs to occur. And I think as a result of that, he weren't offered a very senior position by the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, when she was now trying to form her new team. So he decided, I'll go out with a bang rather than on a whimper, and he went out with a bang.
And do you think that that would trickle down, send a message that he used as making a turn in terms of deciding where to go in terms of its policies towards innovation?
Well, let's see. I think there is
You're
a much
cautiously
greater.
optimistic, Fredrik.
Well, I mean, I'm more optimistic now than I was a few years ago about Europe, in the sense that at least there is the beginning of a realization that Europe needs to change a lot of things in order to improve and to be more capable of shaping economic outcomes in the future. And for a long time now, I think the expression I've used is that we've taken a holiday from economic reality and thought that we could go ahead and basically do whatever we wanted to do, and there weren't going to be any consequences as a result of it. We could regulate data privacy much faster, much deeper, much harder than any other country, and it was not going to have any consequences on, say, app development or how companies invest in different consumer-facing products and services, which gets GDPR covered. Of course, there was always going to be these type of consequences, and we have seen them emerging. And it's a different question if policymakers see all these consequences and then they decide to change and they decide to try to improve on policies. That I don't know, but I think that at least there is an opening now of having a conversation around these issues, which feels more constructive than it was just a few years ago. I think what's also helped here is we had the former governor of the European Central Bank, who just last week released a report on the future of European competitiveness, a report he had been tasked by the European Commission to write, and he was gloomy. My God, he was gloomy. He was sort of talking in a way as we have an existential threat in Europe, that, the type of welfare, the type of society, the type of green policies, the type of peace that we've grown used to over a long period of time, that's not going to endure unless we can also generate the resources in order to pay for it. And hopefully that type of wake-up calls can help us to move policies as well.
Yeah, isn't it amazing the impact that technology has on the fabric of society? Because we're technology is now embedded in it, and then it trickles. The effects of technology and adoption of technology trickles down to every aspect of our lives, and there's no escape from that. You advocate to cloud free trade approach, and some would say, well, now because of the cloud providers from the US that are so advanced, you're potentially just letting, these companies come in and swoop the European Union with their products and services. What's your take on that approach?
Well, it's already happened. If you want to have, say, the most advanced cloud system for business processing optimization, if you want to have a cloud system with the best cybersecurity features, you have to go with one of the big American suppliers. Comparing sort of the top 5 suppliers of cloud service in the world with the top performance in Europe, it's like comparing the newest Porsche with the Ford automobile from the 1960s. That's how big the difference is in terms of quality, in terms of features in that particular service, what you actually can do with it. The cloud sort of free trade approach it's more about that Europe now shouldn't start to introduce barriers which says, well, if you're an American supplier, or if you're headquartered in America, if you're if sort of the passport you carry as a company, if it doesn't say European Union on it, well, then we're going to introduce a barrier, which means that you are not able to compete for contracts, say, in public services. So when public administration going to build up different type of cloud solutions, you're not allowed to compete, even if you can say that, well, all the data that we're going to have here, they are going to be stored in Europe. We're going to draw on human capital and some technologies that we have in other parts of the world, not just America, but in other parts where we have our technology centers. But we're going to create a solution which is safe. It's going to lead to the efficiencies that you demand, but that's not enough. So we've seen contracts for contracts in many different European countries have been denied to basically American big tech because they're American big tech, and they've instead given them to local suppliers, and quite often they haven't been managed to build that system that they were tasked to do in that contract.
The issue is the amount of investment required to so let's say you and I are sitting down and having a coffee somewhere and say, well, why don't we create a data center? Why don't we innovate? And we get some, what are we talking about from a capital expenditure? This is not something that, and it's really in the economy, because to create an application and leverage the cloud has very low barriers to entry. Almost anybody can spin off, go to code something and then spin off a service, and you can see the innovation that way, even leverage LLMs in that process. But to actual creating the data center, we're talking about massive endeavor from a capital expenditure. Also, I'm assuming just in the EU, just getting the permits and getting the space and getting all the required power consumption connection, all of that is massive. So how do we make that change again? Because there's only a few players. It's almost like I would compare it to, you mentioned cars. How many car manufacturers are there? It's almost like you and I decided to let's create a new car. And maybe that's possible, and I've seen some smaller players, but it's still massive expenditure.
That's right. And I don't think that there is, when you have an established market like that, where sort of the R&D spend, only looking at the R&D spend, and you compare, say, AWS, Microsoft, and a few others with the top European cloud suppliers, you're going to see there are oceans in difference in just R&D spend in trying to develop this technology and improve on it. On the CapEx side, so the amount of resources that need to go into building the technology infrastructure, the data infrastructure. Then you have all the other things, the market organization, the business organization, how you can actually have talented people that can go around with your clients and actually create something in their organization, which is not just about the tech itself. It's about what you do with the technology in terms of changing an organization. There is no other company in Europe which are even remotely close to what these big companies are doing. So the whole notion sort of that, it's desirable for Europe to try to sort of start to invest now in order to have sort of a European champion cloud, say, in 20 years' time. I find that to be a remarkably poor way of using your resources. But there's a different way to look at it, which is, well, I'm pretty sure that the cloud market 10 years from now is not going to look like what the cloud markets are doing right now. When you look at the big trends that are happening with, say, a decentralized internet, when you look at 6G, XG, and the developments where you basically break down the barriers between hardware and software, between devices and data, between sort of other type of boundaries that we've grown used to, how we think that we use when we think about how these services are structured, these boundaries are probably not going to be there in the future. And perhaps that's where Europe should try to figure out. Perhaps it should invest more and provide more incentives for companies to invest in all these network equipment producers that we have, the old Ericssons and the old Nokia, what are they going to do in order to change the cloud markets 10 years from now? I think there's an opportunity there. I think it will be much more fruitful as a sort of an overall economic strategy for Europe to think in those terms, rather than to say, so how do we have someone who competes on the existing structural cloud services today, but we compete in 10 years from now with the European champion?
And there are forces in play that I think can really affect that in a positive way.
Oh, absolutely.
The U.S. they're about to create a legislation specifically to prevent from the use of routers and switches that are made in China, for example.
Yep.
So Ericsson, Nokia, it's prime for them to catch up and maybe potentially provide a displacement or an alternative to Chinese routers and switches. And then you see like massive partnerships. Intel just partnered with Amazon AWS to look at the cloud infrastructure specifically around the Intel processes. They're now creating, NVIDIA is obviously leading the way with creation of chips that are specifically designed to run AI engines. And it's bigger. Like who's the equivalent of NVIDIA in EU? AMD is Intel, the chip manufacturers as well. There's almost like a race. We seem like we're in a Cold War around chip manufacturing and around who was going to be able to leverage the AI, in the grand scheme of things for potentially also for national security type of resources. So I always like to leave with a positive note, meaning that your little tugboat trying to move the tanker, you're making an impact. There are people listening, right? Maybe you should start small, as you mentioned, potentially some pockets within the EU that are maybe more innovative. There's certain governments that are looking at potentially creating jobs or creating innovation in their particular geographical area. What's your take on it? If we do this again in 12 months from now, what do you see the impact of some of these efforts from your organization as well as overall in the marketplace?
Well, talking about the positive and ending sort of on a positive note, the good news is that the new type of economy which is emerging, which is heavily driven by not just technology, but by ideas more broadly. Technology is basically the embodied form of a new idea, new knowledge, a new innovation, a new way of looking at different things.
Yeah, capabilities, right? Same as...
Exactly, yeah, exactly. The good news with it is that there is no tariff in the world which is going to stop all that knowledge or these ideas flowing across borders. There may be, say, a GDPR type of regulation, there may be an AI Act which is going to slow things down, but the notion that you actually are going to be able to put up barriers to a kind that all these new ideas aren't going to flow across borders, I find that almost impossible. And I think this is also what we can find that, it's bad news for Europe in the sense that we have a lot of talent, a lot of human capital but they work with organization in other parts of the world. When they have something fascinating, they bring it first to a different part of the world, but at least they have an opportunity to engage with it. And I find that to be an optimistic way of looking at the future, which is that we're not really about to enter into new, say, national security paradigm where we can go back to, say, 1940s or 1950s of having extraordinarily compartmentalized, a compartmentalized world economy where you did this in America, we did this in European countries, you did that in the Soviet countries, etc. I don't really see that happening. Actually, what I see is that organizations are investing even more to have that cross-border structure, how they think, how they develop, how they structure the type of product they're trying to do. So even if you can't market in Europe, you have Europeans sitting in Europe actually developing it, and then it's going to end up being to the benefits of Europe, sort of American consumers rather than European consumers. But I find that to be sort of a good starting point also to think about European possibilities.
Absolutely, and there's an opportunity as well. You look at all these, so because of the gap, so somebody can step up there, maybe vendors and maybe hundreds of thousands of vendors can step in and see an opportunity in that gap. How do we can leverage our expertise into working with the European Union to minimize that gap over time? There's going to be thousands of vendors that potentially can offer maybe the software, the know-how, to get things up to speed, from
Absolutely.
both sides, right? So definitely an opportunity there. Fredrik, thank you very much for joining me today. If people want to reach out to
Thank
you
you so much.
to know more about your organization, maybe just consulting, because you seem to be on the forefront of what's happening and in the kind of the cross section of all the different domains. What's the easiest way for people to reach you?
Well, drop me an email. My email is actually available on our website, which is ecipe.org. Feel free to contact me or contact any of my colleagues, and we're welcoming all sort of good people out there that are willing to engage with us. So feel free to do so.
So do you have an idea for the next paper?
I mean, we have lots of things going on simultaneously, and lots of new things in technology. And I'm also writing a book on technology, which I hope to come out
Phenomenal.
not a long time from now. So
we should do a session before you release the book, maybe talk about that. I'll love to get a copy as well. Fredrik,
Sure.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. For those who joined us, thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. Looking forward to seeing the next episode. And until then, I'll see you guys soon. Thank you very much.